Hello and welcome to today's virtual event, the Korean Peninsula, the incoming Biden administration, and advice from four former chief negotiators, hosted by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. I'm Duyeon Kim, a columnist here with the Bulletin and adjunct senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security, but based in Seoul. It's a real privilege to moderate this timely discussion with our star-studded panel, paired with our host, The Bulletin, which many of you know is the world's top magazine and online resource that equips the public, policymakers, and scientists with the information needed to reduce man-made threats to our existence, particularly nuclear risk, climate change, and disruptive technologies. Now, with just a little over a month until we see change in leadership in the United States, the incoming Biden administration will be faced with a challenging North Korean nuclear problem and complex regional issues that will impact the future of diplomatic negotiations and stability on the Korean Peninsula. So to talk about all these issues, we are joined by four American and South Korean former chief envoys who negotiated all key agreements with North Korea ever since the first nuclear crisis of the 90s. You can see their bios online and they require no introduction, but I will briefly mention one among a very long list of their achievements that is relevant to today's event. In chronological order, we have Ambassador Bob Gallucci joining us from Washington, who negotiated the 1994 agreed framework during the Clinton administration. We also have Ambassador Christopher Hill in New York City, who negotiated all three six-party talks agreements in 2005 and 2007 during the Bush administration. And we have Ambassador Chun Yung-woo in Seoul, who negotiated two of the three six-party talks agreements during the Norton administration. And last but not least, Ambassador Glyn Davies in Washington, who negotiated the 2012 Leap Day deal during the Obama administration. Now, many of our viewers joined us for an event in June with its exact lineup or saw the video on YouTube, during which we discussed why agreements our speakers negotiated were important, why they eventually were not fully implemented, and key issues that have been and will continue to be recurring challenges in future negotiations. But today, we will focus our conversation in the context of an incoming Biden administration and a North Korea with a more advanced nuclear weapons capability, to hear our speakers' wisdom and advice on the way forward. Before we begin, one housekeeping item: please wait until the Q&A to submit your questions in the chat box. Please wait. I know it's tempting, but or else I will miss the early birds questions buried in the pile. Now with that, gentlemen, thank you all very much for joining us today. Let's start with one big question on the lips of policy wonks in basically every capital right now around the world. When will North Korea engage in another provocation? What kind of provocation? And for what objective? Now, let's take a very quick survey of our speakers, starting with Ambassador Gallucci.
Well, it is my hope, and I'm assuming I'm not alone here, that the premise of the question is incorrect, that the North will understand that if they do engage in a provocation, that it's only going to postpone the time at which we could get together and have a business-like engagement, that neither party wants to be on the receiving end of a provocation of the other and go into a negotiation as though they have been blackmailed to join. So I don't know whether the North will, pardon this expression, I mean it metaphorically, hold its fire, but I hope it is wise enough, and we have been around this block enough times that we don't need one or the other side to do something interesting at the very beginning.
Ambassador Chun, what provocation, when, and why?
Well, I would bet against any serious strategic provocation from North Korea. I don't think they are ready to sour any chances for talks with Biden at this point. And I don't think they are interested in getting more sanctions or more vigorous enforcement of sanctions, which will most likely follow any strategic provocation. And their economy is in a very dire situation, not only from the sanctions, but from the border closure due to corona invasion and flood disaster also. So they are in a very difficult position. But so, and one thing is that their provocations are not only driven by political need to test new administration, but I think more by the need for technological advances they need in their missile technology or nuclear technology. But Kim Jong-un declared 3 years ago, December 12th, 2017, that he has a completed nuclear arsenal, all the strategic arsenal. So since then, he focused on developing modern conventional weaponry, but not on nuclear devices or long-range delivery capability. So, and I don't think that I'm not very much worried about possibility of provocations anytime soon. Just to test new Biden administration's, response.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador Hill.
Yeah, I would join the consensus. I don't think there's a big incentive for the North Koreans to test at this point or any way to provoke the Biden administration, provided they're not provoked, and I don't think they will be. I think for them, there's an interest in listening to see how the Biden administration is going to proceed. There's no doubt that they have some desire to test, but not to test us, but rather to test weapon systems. I'm sure there's some pressure within the military to do just that. But for all the reasons that Chun Yung-woo laid out, I don't think they have an interest in adding to their burden right now. Moreover, I think the Biden administration, to the extent it signaled anything on this, there's a willingness or desire to be more collegial with the rest of the world, to work more multilaterally, and I think a test by North Korea would be a gift in that sense to the Biden administration to help it, try to galvanize world opinion. So my expectation would be we don't see a test before January 21st.
What about very soon after, Ambassador Davies, perhaps early on in a new administration?
Right. Well, look, first of all, I think that's right. I don't think North Korea is going to do anything like a 5-star provocation. But I do think that because it's sort of in their nature and because they don't want to be, ignored, we'll probably see something, though it will likely be kind of more on the rhetorical end of the scale, maybe some sort of a, fire and fury light threat to grab attention. It might be a provocation meant to test the waters and split, the allies somehow, or drive a wedge between the United States and the ROK and Japan, or all of us in China, something on that order. I don't know that they'll be completely silent. That would very much be playing against type for North Korea.
What should the Biden administration's goal in terms of just the nuclear component? What should the policy objective be? And is it high time the U.S. just accept and live with a nuclear-armed North Korea indefinitely? Ambassador Chun.
Well, what should the Biden administration
on the
do?
nuclear issue? Should it be denuclearization? Should it be restriction, reduction? Should America finally accept North Korea as a nuclear-armed state indefinitely?
Well, I think giving up the goal of full denuclearization would be a mistake. And I think living with a nuclear-armed North Korea is not an option. It's going to be a curse for US allies in this neighborhood. So that's not a goal to be compromised under any circumstances. But I see no harm in incremental approach, or making progress through incremental approach may be better than no progress or backsliding with a too ambitious goal. We can, I think it's better to move forward to cap and reduce North Korea's nuclear capabilities as part of an interim deal at the outset. But we should never lose sight of the ultimate goal of full denuclearization.
Ambassador Gallucci, your thoughts?
Diana, I position that at least two things are true. One is that a lot of people seem to know that North Korea will never give up their nuclear weapons. The second thing is that a lot of people know a lot of things simply aren't true. And so what I would like to suggest is that we not assume that any of us have the inside track on the grand strategy of North Korea, and that the Kims, all three generations, have all thought the same thing, that they were always going to hold on to nuclear weapons and they were always going to get nuclear weapons to hold on to. I don't know any of that. That all may be true. So since we don't know it, in a sense, there's enormous incentive for the United States and its allies in Northeast Asia to turn the Korean Peninsula into a place where there are no nuclear weapons, a nuclear weapons-free zone, if you will, that we ought to work towards that. Now, will there be stages or steps along the way in which there's a freeze, in which there's a reduction in capability? Yes, there are. I don't think we're looking at a relationship with the DPRK in which there are going to be great leaps forward. Much more likely, little steps, and the little steps are fine. So I would look for incremental project towards an objective that I think everyone would agree would be most desirable. And I see no reason to prematurely leap to concede defeat.
On your point about nuclear weapon-free zone, though, I think there is a definitional difference between the U.S. and North Korea. The U.S. and everyone else thinks nuclear-free North Korea. North Korea defines nuclear weapons-free zone as the entire peninsula, which means no U.S. troops, no U.S. strategic assets, no South Korea-U.S. alliance. But that might be something that is to come in future discussions.
If I may, Dion, we're nuclear weapons-free zone is not a phrase that I just made up right now, as you well know. There are a number of, I think, 5 nuclear weapons-free zones in the world today, and the United States can comport with that, the existence of such zones. And I think if we break off here and we went into a side room, a chat room for 45 minutes, we could design a nuclear weapons-free zone for Northeast Asia that would be compatible with American alliances with both South Korea and Japan. I'm not saying we want to do that necessarily. And I had nuclear weapons-free zone not with capital letters, but with small letters. I meant an area in which there were no nuclear weapons. The United States, as you know, does not deploy them in South Korea, does not have a need to deploy them. It doesn't mean we couldn't defend South Korea with nuclear weapons if necessary, but we don't need to deploy them on their soil. That's all.
Ambassador Davies, nuclearization, limited weapons capability, or live with nuclear armed North Korea forever?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, Duyeon?
Policy objective on the nuclear front.
Sure. Well, I think we have the advantage of Biden having kind of laid this out back in the spring in his foreign policy article. And I think what he said in foreign policy he would do, and I hope he'd do it, which is to jumpstart an effort with our allies, the ROK and Japan, to get back into restating and advancing, our shared objective to denuclearize North Korea. And I'd hope that by the end of, I don't know, a matter of months, we'd have lined up our negotiating partners, not just our allies, but particularly the Chinese and maybe even the Russians, to reach a general understanding about the way forward, so we can begin kind of collectively messaging the DPRK regime about our interest in re-engaging on this, on denuclearization and all the other issues. I mean, I think that I really do hope that what he laid out 8 or 9 months ago is the template that he uses to go forward.
I want to get to your point about resuming negotiations right after we hear from Ambassador Hill. Your views on the objective of, or what the U.S. policy should be on the nuclear issue.
Well, I would agree with those who've said there should be no retreat from our basic objective, which is that North Korea go back to not having nuclear weapons ambitions. Obviously, that's going to be very difficult, and with every day it becomes even more difficult. That said, I have never subscribed to the view that this is some kind of existential question for North Korea, that somehow they need nuclear weapons to protect themselves. I think the nuclear weapons are out there for them to try to create a circumstance where we no longer want to stay on the Korean Peninsula. So, like a lot of things, I think this is going to require some intense discussions with the North Koreans. I think we ought to reaffirm the goal of doing away with nuclear weapons in North Korea. The North Koreans have been willing to do that in general terms. And then I would try to, once that principle is well established, and I think it probably bears some repeating because the language in Singapore was a little vague, to put it mildly. I think once that's understood, I think then the issue is going to be to look at these sanctions packages and see whether that can be disaggregated and whether we can do small deal for small deal and try to move in the direction. So it's not going to be exciting. It's more kind of sausage making, but I think the Biden administration would be making a very bad mistake if it wanted to retreat from the goal, especially for regional partners. And whether you talk about multilateralism or bilateralism, I think what's important is you have to have partners involved in a process. Think of multilateralism as a platform on which you can do a lot of things bilaterally and not have a situation where the North Koreans can go shopping for a better deal. One other point, which is it's going to be tough this time, but you recall at the start of the Bush administration, there was essentially no willingness to pick up on the agreed framework, which had been pretty successful, albeit with the understanding that the North Koreans did appear to be interested in highly enriched uranium, which was not part of the agreed, or not directly a part of the agreed framework, et cetera. I think we ought to be careful not to lose time. I'm not suggesting a repeat of these kind of reality TV that we had during the Trump administration, but there was an effort by the Trump administration to say this is important, and I'd like to see that continued, even though to be very frank, I don't think there's a lot of the Trump administration I would like to see ever again, and certainly not in my lifetime.
Let's talk about North Korea's objectives then, or what we think are their objectives. In a very quick rapid fire round, one word answer for all of our ambassadors. Do you think North Korea will ever give up its nuclear weapons? Yes, no, or maybe? You can only choose one. Ambassador Gallucci, you're laughing. Let's go with you.
Maybe. I'm confident. I'm certain the answer is maybe.
Okay, Ambassador Chun, yes, no, or maybe?
No, if North Korea can survive without denuclearization.
Okay,
but I have to elaborate a little bit. I would not rule out the possibility that North Korea will prefer regime survival without nuclear weapons to regime collapse with nuclear weapons, if that choice is forced upon them. So it's not as clear cut as you want.
Exactly. Okay, and we'll dig more into that a little bit later. Ambassador Hill, yes, no, or maybe?
You should never give diplomats the opportunity to say maybe.
Okay.
I think North Korea is looking for an American-free Korean Peninsula in the long run, although they make kind of odd comments from time to time that they like us there. But I think the real issue is to try to dominate the Korean Peninsula, and that would be the product of an interaction with us and the South Koreans.
Ambassador Davies, yes, no, or maybe?
Yes.
Still going to push us on you.
Yes, I think North Korea will eventually. It might be a long road to get there, but you know, we have to work to bring that about. But I think, you know, as we used to say at the end of every day in our office when I worked on this issue, you know, we're one day closer to unification. But I also think every day we're one day closer to denuclearization. It's, you know, I think for North Korea, it's a road. If they go down it, it won't in the end bring them anything other than continued isolation.
Well, Ambassador Glyn, you had a point.
Yeah, I know I said maybe, but I also want to point out that if the answer is yes, North Korea will give up their nuclear weapons, I've been sticking to this, my next comment, for quite a while, and I'm pretty confident it's correct. North Korea will always, no matter what they do, no matter what inspections we have, be a threshold nuclear weapon state. They have built nuclear weapons. They have fissile material. No matter what kind of intrusive inspections we may eventually succeed in imposing upon the DPRK, they have dining room tables under which they can put fissile material for an arsenal. So I think we have to remember that. And the North understands that. And if they can rejoin the NPT and accept IAEA safeguards, it still means only that at that moment, they are some distance from a deployed nuclear weapons capability, but they will never be out of reach. The CVID nonsense that was part of American politics on North Korea for a while was nonsense. There's nothing irreversible about what will be done to the North. And we have to remember that. The North knows it, and we should be honest with ourselves about it.
And on that point, another point is knowledge, nuclear knowledge. Even if we got rid of everything, all the physical parts and materials, they've got the knowledge, they've got the personnel and the scientists. Very briefly, Ambassador Chun, let's just a very short recap of the October military parade, because we're talking about North Korea's capabilities. You know, yes, that humongous intercontinental ballistic missile, of course, you know, that stole the show and it's a big concern, yes. But I have argued that, you know, they also sent a more dire message in the more near to midterm by showing off new weapons such as short-range ballistic missiles and others that can actually be used in war on the peninsula. What was most eye-catching to you? And has the risk of conflict increased based on what you saw in that parade?
Well, the most impressive ones are the short-range solid fuel missiles like Iskander, North Korean Iskander, or multiple tube big caliber rockets. These are all new. They have tested several times from last year to this year, right? But I think what they have shown in the parade are primarily for domestic political consumption, to cheer up the North Korean people who have been suffering from triple crisis that I have mentioned earlier, right? The sanctions, the coronavirus, and flood disaster. So it has been a more difficult year for North Koreans than others. So there was need to cheer up North Korean people from the plight they are in. So I think the message is that we have nothing to fear now. We are not only a nuclear superpower on a par with the US, but we are also we have a modernized tactical conventional strike capabilities that can crush any hostile act from the US or South Korea. With this, I think what Kim Jong-un may have intended was to tell the North Koreans, let's move on to economic development without worrying about threats from outside. So in my view, it's not only about showing their military prowess. I think all those short-range missiles, they are more difficult to detect and eliminate before they use, but I think, ROK with a better surveillance and reconnaissance assets, they can deal with that kind of threat.
But taking that, Ambassador Gallucci, President Trump's red line was ICBM and nuclear tests. And supposedly he told Kim Jong-un that if that line is crossed, North Korea is obliterated. What should President-elect Biden's red line be?
The first thing I would suggest to President Biden is that he avoid the phrase red line at all costs. We've had not good experience with that phrase. And so I would put it aside. I think that we will respond, the United States of America will respond as necessary for its own security and that of its allies to any provocations that the North may undertake, period, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think what you're getting at here, though, is an important point. And in the piece you wrote, and you said, hey, don't look at the big fat missile, look at those skinny little missiles, because those are the ones they actually would use in a conflict, and we have to focus on that. I get that, and I think we all get that, and it was a correct point. Howsoever, I think everybody understands, and the United States of America can be forgiven for focusing on the big fat missiles. I mean, those missiles which can destroy American cities tend to focus the American attention, like Dr. Johnson said about a hanging. We worry about that when they can reach us. It's not that we don't value our alliances and people who live in Northeast Asia, but we also value our own country, and the whole concept of extended deterrence comes into another phase of discussion once the country presuming to extend deterrence is itself vulnerable to an attack by the presumed adversary. And that's what we're really dealing with here. So that if we ask, what's the, to use another phrase, the pucker factor here for the United States of America, isn't those short-range missiles that would be important in the event of a engagement on the peninsula. What the United States is focused on is the possibility that by accident or miscalculation or intent that North Koreans would in fact launch an intercontinental ballistic missile at the continental United States. And notwithstanding our somewhat less than airtight ballistic missile defense, were to penetrate, the consequences would be extraordinary. The North, we believe, probably has a thermonuclear weapons capability, orders of magnitude greater in destruction than we saw at Hiroshima.
Right.
Please go ahead.
Considering the potential for that risk, this calculation accident, and all the other risks associated with the nuclear arm North Korea, Ambassador Hill, there are questions and concerns, especially in Seoul, regarding President Biden's priority list amid so many other very important and pressing global challenges, U.S.-China strategic competition, Iran climate change, and not to mention all the domestic challenges he will be facing. And so how high should the Korean Peninsula issue be on President-elect Biden's list of priorities in his agenda?
I certainly take your point. I mean, there are enormous problems just within the U.S., let alone any foreign policy issue. But I would put the North Korean issue kind of up there. I don't know, top 5 or so, top 3, whatever. I think it's up there because it goes to an alliance management question. We have those issues in Europe, and we definitely have those issues in Asia, and in particular with what Bob Gallucci was talking about with the issue of extended deterrence. To some extent, you could just look at Trump's concern about long-range weapons as another America First approach, and that's probably how it was sold to him. But I think it also speaks to the fact that the U.S. just will not see an attack on an ally as an attack on the U.S., which is refuting the whole concept of allies. So I think you will see North Korea as a major issue because we need to shore up alliances. And by the way, I really think the solution has to be ensconced in a kind of regional approach. it's not very helpful to have this kind of cold relationship between the ROK and Japan. I think there ought to be a little more U.S. activity in terms of trying to address that, or certainly address public aspects of it. And so I would suspect that very soon you'll get the U.S. organized for dealing with North Korea, with the understanding that it's not just about North Korea, it's about alliance management. And by the way, it's about finding patterns of cooperation with China, a place we haven't really mentioned very much.
Exactly, and those are excellent points. Let's unpack those allies, alliances, and China cooperation in our next section. But first, Ambassador Davies, what should President-elect or future President Biden do in his first week and first 100 days on the North Korea or the Korean Peninsula issue? And the others can chime in.
Yeah, that's right. No, I think, number one is to get with our allies, discuss the issue with them. Obviously, it'll be top of the hit parade of issues that are brought to him by the ROK, I think Japan, China as well. And I kind of think that the priority of North Korea as a challenge and as an issue for us is going to emerge naturally from those conversations. I mean, it's the elephant in the room when you're talking to Northeast Asian leaders and diplomats. And so even if there isn't any kind of a provocation from the North, inshallah, they hold themselves back, I think it's going to emerge naturally. And then, of course, as I said earlier, he's already laid out North Korea as one of the top line issues that he intends to tackle. And I would also add that he's an official, he's an experienced statesman who knows this issue well, and I think he'll naturally gravitate toward it, recognizing how important it is to resolve.
Earlier, Ambassador Davies and the others mentioned the need to resume negotiations. Ambassador Hill, all of you gentlemen have experienced your share of stalemates, long months, maybe a couple of years, for 1 or 2 years for a few of you, and then resumption of diplomatic negotiations. And we're in another stalemate now. North Korea for a long time has been refusing to return to the dialogue table, but only on its terms. It will on its terms. And then now we have COVID, and we've also seemed to prefer symmetry and not working level talks. Even if there were to be working level talks, North Korean negotiators are not empowered, have not been empowered to talk about the nuclear issue. So that's real, very practically, if possible. I know this is there's no crystal or there's no silver bullet for this question, but how do you and how should the Biden administration try to persuade North Korea back to the negotiating table?
Well, I think the most important diplomatic talks that need to take place early on are the ones with the other players in the region. I would be reluctant to say we're starting up the six-party talks again, but I would also be reluctant to kind of pursue this bilaterally. So I think one of the first things we'd want to do is see if there's a consensus among the players in the region. Searching for common ground with the Chinese in and of itself is, I think, a useful exercise in dealing with China. I mean, we're not going to be able to stare at each other and work out our problems together, but maybe we can work on a problem of mutual interest. So I think the first thing is to see if there's a consensus among players. By the way, that number 6 wasn't happenstance. I mean, these are the players. I don't know if someone else might want to be involved in it as well, or if someone would want to drop out of it, say the Russians, who have never been very, how to put it, helpful players in all this. But I think we need to get that consensus. And we need to get that consensus because otherwise the North Koreans are very good initiative shoppers. They like to go to different countries and get somewhat different nuances about how to proceed, and then try to keep us split. So I think we need to work with partners and allies and really make a big deal of that early on, even before we've approached the North Koreans, or a group of us have approached the North Koreans, however we finally decide it's worth doing. I might add that during the contact group, when we're dealing with Bosnia, you know, sometimes we'd kind of take turns at it. You know, the Europeans would take a run at the Bosnian Serbs, and the U.S. would take a run. Sometimes we had the Russians take a run at them. So you know, there are different models, but I think the key thing is to get a consensus about how to proceed.
Master Chun, how do you persuade or incentivize North Korea to just show up without preconditions at the table in today's context and in the future?
Well, I don't know how, but I think the first thing to do for the Biden administration is to designate a chief nuclear negotiator or special envoy for North Korea as a matter of priority, and reach out to North Korea. And instead of begging North Korea to come out, I think US can wait until North Korea decides to come out. I think coronavirus would be an impediment for them to come out for talks face to face. But I think they will, in due time, come out. They will not beg for talks with the US because they see it as a sign of weakness. And they don't want to show any sign of weakness. But when the US team is in place, and when the US is ready to get into serious talks with North Korea, and there are no impediments for talks like coronavirus, I think they are in dire need of getting out of the current mess in North Korea. So I think they will, without thinking about how to bring them out into the talks, I think waiting until they decide to come out, but not to provoke them into other directions. That's very important. Naming and shaming North Korea could make it more difficult for North Korea to come out to talks, because that would be seen as a weakness. It would look like a surrendering to U.S. demands, or that could weaken their position. That's their concern. So last thing they want to show is a sign of weakness. So take your time, but I think North Korea is in more dire need of talks than the U.S. They claim that the time is on their side. They insist, they emphasize that time is on their side, but I don't believe that time is necessarily on their side.
So, and as you mentioned, there is going to be some time until we see talks resume, if and when they do. In the meantime, Ambassador Davies, there's a lot that the incoming Biden administration can do to prepare. Let's talk about possible U.S. approach and possible elements of a future deal. President-elect Biden has said that he will engage in principled diplomacy, and that's been up for various interpretations, especially here in Seoul. But nevertheless, in the past, and all of you gentlemen know this very well, U.S. denuclearization strategies have, focused principally on two broad approaches which are divergent. One is incentive-oriented on the presumed demand side of the nuclear equation, and the other strategy has been focusing on the supply side, and constraints and preventing, the supply side. So, Ambassador Davies, where should the focus be? The supply side, demand side, both, somewhere else?
Well, look, I think our policy has always been, a combination of the two. These are two sides of the same coin. Both carrots and sticks are necessary, and they're not mutually exclusive. But I think that they're mutually reinforcing. And I don't think North Korea is going to move meaningfully unless we find ways to put pressure on them. There could arise an opportunity where we could show, our interest in helping North Korea deal with a specific problem, whether it's flooding or a need for certain things. Maybe COVID ends up being an area we could operate in if the North Koreans would only admit that they, like the rest of the world, are afflicted by it. So, I think there's going to have to be a little bit of improvisation here, but within the context of these the principles that I think are fairly well established and are solid, and we ought to stick with.
Ambassador Gallucci, some experts argue that the more sticks you use on North Korea, the more provocative it becomes. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm not a wild enthusiast for sticks. I do, let me just protect my right flank here and say that in the event of a provocation, a missile test, nuclear weapons test, the United States needs to do something both for domestic reasons, for allied reasons, and for lessons for the North, et cetera, et cetera. But generally speaking, I think the work that needs to be done by a new administration that I hope will begin with a policy review, which is traditional. This is not a brand new idea. That's what new administrations do, but a policy review on North Korea. And I think there's lots of work that needs to be done, but the most work that needs to be done is on what the United States means by normalization and what are we prepared to do. I mean, we've spent a lot of time saying that denuclearization is a word that means a lot of different things to different people. Yeah, but so does normalization. And what does that word mean for the United States going forward? Never mind, I appreciate the question about sticks, but never mind the sticks, put them aside. What are we prepared to do in terms of normalizing relations with the DPRK? What do we need in terms of how they address human rights? What are we prepared to do in terms over the long term of military operations and joint military operations? How do we treat our alliance, something you mentioned earlier? What does the United States do in terms of dealing with, in an operational sense, its alliance relations, which has for us to do with more than South Korea. It has to do with Japan and China. What do we do in a normalizing mode with it? I think that's where the work for the US really needs to be done early on. And I hope at the beginning of a Biden administration, there's a policy review in which that is taken seriously.
Ambassador Hill, I'd like to, if you would like to respond to what Ambassador Gallucci just mentioned on the normalization and the other components of the deal, but he demands that both sides, the U.S. and North Korea, things like normalization, things like denuclearization, sanctions relief, peace treaty, all of that. All of those demands on both sides have not really changed. The big ones have not really changed decades. And another big question among policy circles and research circles is, can there really be a new, creative, bold approach? Or have we exhausted all options in terms of configuring the different bargaining chips?
Well, I mean, we won't really know until we sit down with them, but I think the sort of all or nothing sanctions approach by the Trump administration was probably, it was not going to work, and I think did more to tie the hands of the Trump administration than it did North Korea. In fact, it made it very easy for North Korea. So I think one issue is we need to, and I've always felt we needed to kind of pursue these things on a step-by-step basis with a clear understanding of what the ultimate goal is. At one point, Bob Gallucci mentioned I have to cover my right flank, which actually he didn't really need to do that. But I would point out that a big part of our discussions of the problems that we've had in pursuing North Korea is that there's been no consensus in the US. So I'm kind of hopeful that maybe the experience of having President Trump engage with this, with the leadership there for several times, would at least to some extent constitute more willingness for a negotiator to do what the negotiator has to do. I mean, when I was doing this, I would get such helpful instructions. Instruction cables are kind of Christmas trees. People just put whatever ornament they want. And I got instructions like, you should not shake their hands. You should not toast with the North Koreans. You should not, essentially I'm supposed to sit there like a stiff through the conversation. Well, I like to think that didn't happen, but I do think the U.S. we need to look at this as a nasty problem out there, and not just look at it as a series of gestures, but as a way to get at it. And I do believe that a step-by-step process of saying, look, you agree to denuclearization, we will agree to normalization, and this is what we have in mind, but we're going to normalize with a denuclearizing North Korea, not with a country that is saying it has to be a nuclear weapon state.
Then, Ambassador Hill, should the Biden administration keep the Singapore joint statement as a framework and a starting point to follow on negotiations?
I don't think it was such a great statement. Maybe some of the gist of it ought to be continued, just as the gist of the September 2005 statement ought to remain. I think the problem with kind of emphasizing these things from the past is you end up getting more mired in it than moving forward. But if the Singapore statement is that the U.S. will eventually will normalize with a denuclearized North Korea, sure, that's fine. What I found very worrisome about the Singapore fling was that at the end of it, President Trump talked about, he learned to speak some North Korean by talking about hostile war games and how these exercises are expensive, et cetera. And he seemed to suggest that US troops are going to be on the table. And while I can see some confidence building measures in the context of a denuclearized North Korea, I don't see that kind of approach was particularly helpful. Someone even asked me, should he use Donald Trump as a special envoy? That was a fairly easy question. I kid you not. That was a fairly easy question to answer. But I think, as I said earlier, we do need to be careful not to repudiate everything that's been done in the past, because I think we have a tendency to start from the beginning all the time.
Thank you. Ambassador Chun, there's a lot of debate. It's been a long time for this debate, but especially more so now, about sequencing the denuclearization process and the peace process. Proponents of peace in the US, South Korea, Europe argue we must end the Korean War first and make peace with North Korea to help solve the nuclear issue. Other experts and stakeholders say, no, we need to focus first on denuclearization and then embark on a peace process. Do you agree? Why or why not?
Well, to put this question in context, let's bear in mind that permanent peace regime is something that was promised to North Korea, not only in Singapore. It was promised already in 2005 in six-party joint statement, September 19 joint statement. So that's part of the package reward for North Korea denuclearization. So that's part of the what North Korea would deem as the abandonment of U.S. hostile policy, together with security assurance, new U.S. diplomatic relations. These are all components of, the abandonment of U.S. what North Korea deems as U.S. hostile policy. And another thing that we have to keep in mind is that peace agreement is different from end of war declaration. So if you look at the process of concluding a peace agreement, you can notionally divide that into about 5 steps. You can begin with the peace declaration, then at the second phase, you begin negotiations on the text of the peace regime, peace agreement. Then you have to initial, once the text is agreed upon, then you initial. And then comes the ceremony to sign the document, the official signing ceremony. And then, finally the entry into force of the agreement. A peace agreement can only come into force when North Korea's denuclearization is complete. It cannot be given. And the legally binding end of war declaration can exist only after the peace agreement enters into force, because normally the preamble or the first paragraph of any peace agreement begins with, "We hereby terminate the state of war." That's the end of war declaration that is legally effective. But what we are talking about in terms of peace declaration is just a declaration of intent to negotiate a peace agreement. So that can be done far earlier than, and it should be done far earlier than the date of entry into force of the peace agreement. This is that can be an initial step toward conclusion of a peace agreement. So I don't see any harm in giving away this peace declaration once North Korea is ready to give up an equivalent part of their nuclear program. For instance, if they agree to cap and limit their nuclear capabilities, I see no harm as a starting point to give away the peace declaration as a first step in the way to concluding a peace agreement. So, there is some philosophical aversion to peace declaration. But if we have promised them a peace agreement, and as long as North Korea is willing to abide by its own denuclearization commitment, we cannot run away from peace agreement. And peace declaration is only one of 5-6 steps that leads to peace agreement. That's not a big deal. If we can substitute sanctions relief that North Korea demands, I think it's not such a bad thing.
To pick up on your point of cap and freeze, Ambassador Gallucci, there are some in the Washington non-proliferation community who argue that the U.S. should negotiate an interim deal as a first step that freezes and caps North Korea's missile material production and weapons production and flight testing. Is this the right approach? Or there are others who say, well, if you only focus on that, then we'll never get to denuclearization, because after the interim deal, North Korea will say, okay, that our job is done. How do you secure commitment and action to real denuclearization beyond that point? And is that set up, in your mind, a good approach? Start with this freeze interim deal first.
So I've not been enthusiastic about getting into the tactics of the negotiations with the North, because I think that the tactics will come out of the larger strategic approach to the discussions and the body posture of the North, when they come into a meeting, assuming they will. So I will say that it has struck me as more than passing strange that some advocates want us, indeed this administration wanted to move to the end game before they did the rest of the game. I mean, they wanted to come down to the goal line first and say, okay, why don't you make a full and complete declaration? That seems very reasonable to us, of everything you have, where it's located, and then we can start destroying it. And then after that, we might, take off some sanctions. So this is kind of nutty to me. And the idea, the discussion about whether we should go action for action, reciprocity, a staged approach, step by step. To me, that seems like an inevitable way of moving any kind of distance with the North. If we really are hoping to get down the road to a normal relationship between the US and the DPRK, we really are hoping to substantially freeze and carve back the nuclear weapons capability of the North with an ultimate goal of denuclearization. It's going to be a process. It's going to take a while. It's going to have a lot of steps. It could have stages in which you group steps, which is kind of what the agreed framework was 25 years ago. So I think all that thinking, it's useful, I suppose, and it should be in a policy review. But I'm much more enthusiastic about looking at the overall strategic approach we wish to take. What does the United States want as the future political arrangements that characterize Northeast Asia. What are we looking for out of our alliances and our relationship with China, and where does the Korean Peninsula fit within that Asian Pacific context for the United States of America? I mean, if we can figure those things out, then the tactics, which your question went to, of the negotiations will come, I think, from the negotiators. I mean, you got to give them something to do.
We will go to talk about allies in China in just 30 seconds. But Ambassador Davies, before we get there in 30 seconds, if a future deal is made, if and when, but even before that, because as all of you gentlemen, you prepare for these way in advance of any deal being struck, verification of any or all components of that deal would likely be one of the toughest battles, because fundamentally North Korea is allergic to transparency and for all other reasons. Do you see a role for the IAEA in any future agreements and preparations leading up to it? Can North Korea be convinced to permit the IAEA back in and to do verification?
Yeah, I've always been an advocate of a big role for the IAEA, not least because I know how capable the organization is, the safeguards department of the IAEA. I think the IAEA is essential because it's, you've got 150 plus nations who belong to the IAEA. It has the expertise. If it is part of this effort, then whatever results from it, if it's a positive sort of agreement, these 150 nations can help us, reinforce the need for North Korea to follow through on it. By the way, we get a lot of pushback sometimes from our own elements in the U.S. government about, we need to do it. We've got the capability to do it. But I think the IAEA ends up, it's a Maserati of an organization. They have a track record there, which is part of the reason why the North Koreans are have been so dead set against them. But I think the IAEA ought to be brought in, ought to be utilized at the very least to try to gain kind of global backing for the effort.
Before we turn it over to the audience Q&A, very briefly, Ambassador Hill, because you stressed a lot about China, and that's a very important point. How an increasing difficult and complex environment and relationship with the US and China, clearly they're going to have to cooperate in some areas and compete in other areas. How do you encourage or convince Beijing to be more effective on North Korea amid all the other US-China issues that they have to deal with?
Okay, I just picking up on one thing from the previous discussion. I have no problem with what we actually, as Chun Yung-woo pointed out, what we did in the 2005 statement and what President Trump alluded to in the Singapore statement, that we'd be prepared for some kind of process of normalization. I guess, though, to some extent, I'm guided by that old line from psychology that you can never get enough of what you don't really want. And I don't think that's really what the North Koreans want. I think they want something else. And I think the task of the negotiator needs to kind of figure that out. And one of the real difficulties of dealing with the North Koreans is they rarely kind of meet you in the hallway outside of the negotiating room and say, hey, this is what we really want. This is what we're really trying to get. And then you could kind of work with that. I mean, what you get from them is always at the sort of official table. So, which is what makes it so frustrating. But I really think that China, I know, there are 1.4 billion people there, and they probably have 1.4 billion ways to handle this, but I don't think China wants to see a nuclear North Korea. I think they do share our goal there. For the reasons that have been written about a million times, they're not interested in insecurity or instability or, all kinds of issues. But I really think in terms of working with the Chinese, there's a basis for getting to yes on that. I think the problem is, of course, there's a mountain of mistrust right now. And I think, as the president-elect has said on several occasions, we need to find some way to cooperate with them on issues of mutual interest, whether it's climate change or North Korea. So I really think there's more we can do. There's a lot of energy in the US devoted to the idea that every single problem in the world is caused by China. And that has to be overcome to some extent. And I think we ought to be prepared to do as Secretary Pompeo was not willing to do, have kind of regular discussions and see if we can reach, find areas where we can agree. And I don't think we would have difficulties coming to a basic concept of what we need to do with the North Koreans. So I think China is absolutely key. It's clearly not flavor of the month in Washington. It's hard to talk about cooperation with China. People look at you like you're hopelessly naive, but it is 1/6 of humanity, and I think we ought to, take it seriously now and again.
Final question to Ambassador Chun, but as you're answering, if the audience would like to now start typing your question, very brief question, please, in the chat box. I'll go through and read them out. Ambassador Chun, final question on allies. Very briefly, please, for the sake of time. Do you foresee the new Biden-Moon alliance, the very beginning, from day one, very early on, do you foresee the Biden-Moon alliance being in sync, in lockstep, or do you foresee some challenges, maybe some divergent approaches? Please just pick one or the other, and please tell us one top issue you think the Biden-Moon governance alliance should address. One issue.
Well, in terms of goals and approaches to denuclearization, I think Biden administration and Moon administration are very close. They share almost the same goals and approaches. They support President Moon supports incremental approach and limitation on North Korea's capabilities instead of full denuclearization, which they consider as unrealistic. But I think they could clash on specific ways and means, priorities, time frame, etc. For instance, on the role of sanctions, I believe that President Biden, if he draws lessons from the experience of Iran nuclear deal, I think the new team will believe in the utility of sanctions. Sanctions can increase U.S. negotiating leverage, and that's the way to get a deal acceptable to the U.S. But I don't think that President Moon will be very enthusiastic about sanctions. What he wants is breakthrough in inter-Korean relations. And anything that delays or makes it difficult to arrive at a breakthrough in inter-Korean relations will be unacceptable to the Moon administration. So Moon administration wants sanctions relief as soon as possible, whether there is progress in denuclearization or not, because sanctions relief is the best way for President Moon to achieve his and to promote his inter-Korean projects, which is more important than denuclearization for President Moon. So that's one thing. That's one point of friction between U.S. and ROK. Another is the timing of the U.S. DPRK summit. You know that the U.S. is likely to adopt a bottom-up approach, right? Unlike Trump administration. And President Moon will try to persuade President Biden to meet with Kim Jong-un as early as possible. So there, I think there will be some disagreement. And on human rights is going to be a big issue
Yes.
that will divide ROK and the US. Human rights for all other countries is important, but offending North Korea on human rights, this is less thing that President Moon wants to do. While I believe that President Biden's administration will take human rights issue as a matter of priority. So there will be a class of philosophy on human rights. It's important to promote human rights everywhere else in the world, except in North Korea. For one government, for another country, human rights everywhere is important. So that will be a problem to reconcile between the new administration and President Moon.
Thank you, Ambassador Chun. Those are excellent points. Let's now turn it over to question and answers. I like to ask our speakers to jot down your own notes, because I will read a few at a time, just so we can save time and get in as many questions as possible. And for our viewers, please forgive me in advance if I mispronounce your name. Please excuse the ignorance there. The first question comes from Alan Lutz. Why shouldn't President Biden-elect Biden begin by offering North Korea diplomatic recognition? So why shouldn't the Biden administration start by giving North Korea diplomatic recognition? There is another question by Halvard Kip from Norway, who is asking, could President Clinton possibly provide a Jimmy Carter moment as a special envoy for the Biden administration? And I'll just do three at a time. Another question, this is particular to Ambassador Gallucci, recognizing that North Korea would always retain a breakout capability, what would be a realistic break time for the US to work toward a denuclearization of North Korea? Let's start with those three.
I can super quick.
Yes, Ambassador Davies.
Recognition. Look, we're at war, and so I don't think it's the moment to do that. That's always been viewed, and I think properly so, as kind of the final capstone. Once you've worked everything out, you can move toward diplomatic recognition. Trump came close with, his series of kumbaya meetings with Kim Jong-un to signaling that we would eventually get there. But I just don't think diplomatic recognition ought to be on the table yet.
Okay. Ambassador Chun.
Yeah, from a Korean perspective, or from my perspective, rather than the Korean government's perspective, I think diplomatic recognition is a big deal for North Korea, and also for the US. And this is, the new US-DPRK relations that comes first in the first paragraph of the Singapore Joint Statement. That's what North Korea values greatly, and this is not something to give away, just as a gift before North Korea, fulfills its denuclearization commitment. So, normalized relations, the recognition of diplomatic relations, and security assurance, peace agreement, all those things have to be timed for the completion of denuclearization. So these are the most important cards to play in getting North Korea to denuclearization, whether, if it is ever going to be possible. You don't have to throw away the most important chips that you have in your hands. So these you have to hold. Even when North Korea completes denuclearization, I think there will be a lot of criticism about recognizing North Korea a totalitarian, the worst totalitarian regime in the world, as a normal state that U.S. can deal with, diplomatically. That's going to be a big deal. But denuclearization is such an overriding objective. So if that is going to be achieved, diplomatic recognition is something that U.S. may have to give away, but not now.
Ambassador Hill, would you like to take the President Bill Clinton as special envoy question?
Yeah, first of all, let me just say on diplomatic recognition, I think it is an end game element. Successive negotiators, however, myself included, have proposed the idea of opening liaison offices, which is broadly understood sort of way station on the way to diplomatic recognition. And I was very struck by the fact that the North Koreans turned me down on the spot. They didn't even suggest they needed to ask Pyongyang. So it's clear that that's not really a priority for them, and diplomatic relations, I'm not sure, is really as much of a priority as we think it is. But in any event, it's an endgame item. And as for bringing a former president in to, I don't know, kickstart negotiations, I never see any real problem with this sort of thing. But again, I don't think the problem is the lack of a good messenger. I think the problem is that the North Koreans aren't interested in engaging. And so I think if there's a specific issue, some kind of release of an American or something, if that's what the North Koreans want, fine, we can do that. But I don't think that's the issue. That in and of itself will cause a moment where the North Koreans will make progress on denuclearization.
Bob, breakout time.
If I understood the question correctly, look, there is good news and bad news in the observation I was trying to make earlier about the threshold character of the North Korean state, that it will always be a threshold nuclear weapon state, no matter what denuclearization it experiences and accepts, because it can always regenerate its program. It built its program and it could do it again. If we take apart its enrichment program, take apart its reprocessing, even if it had no peaceful nuclear energy program, it could still regenerate. And then there is the truth of just how little the quantities are of material to make up nuclear weapons. The fissile material that was used for the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima was about a baseball size. So how many baseballs could you fit under that dining room table? You know, what kind of inventory could exist someplace in North Korea, no matter what inspection regime was put in place? That was my only point. Not that it should undercut the enthusiasm, the political enthusiasm for denuclearizing the North and having the North not be a nuclear weapon state. That should still remain our goal, and we should look for steps along the way to get there. And that includes the delivery capability too, that they give up those ICBMs, which make no sense without nuclear weapons. Indeed, neither do IRBMs or MRBMs. When you get back down to short-range missiles, then conventional delivery, conventional munitions make some sense. In any case, I think that the problem that was embedded in the question is not a big problem. I can be correct about the threshold character of the North Korean state forever, but still embrace the goal of denuclearization as the correct one for the U.S. and the international community when dealing with the North.
The next question is from Hans Joachim Schmidt. What can Europe do to support possible talks? And I get this question a lot from European ambassadors here in Seoul. It's a great question. What can Europe do? Another question is from somebody who does not have a name here, but it's a good question. How would you advise the Biden administration on the U.S. ROK combined military exercises they regularly conduct? Would you advise the Biden administration to resume these drills, or does it risk destroying the tacit freeze for freeze? Does it disrupt diplomacy and the future of diplomacy? Another good question is from Doug Hostetter, sorry for that pronunciation. What do you see as the role of NGOs and humanitarian organizations in building understanding and relationship between North Korea and the West? And our speakers can take any of those, or you can choose. Yes, and that's Chun.
May I touch on the joint military exercises?
Yes.
I think it could North Korea will, if it wishes to resort to strategic provocation, they used to take the joint military exercises as a pretext. So there is a risk of, provoking North Korea into some sort of their share of military provocation. So I think the Moon administration will be very reluctant to resume joint exercises with the U.S. And that's also part of the Panmunjom Declaration that Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in signed 2 years ago. So I don't know how that will, how the Moon administration will see it, but I would be surprised if President Moon agrees to the resumption of joint military exercises. But we would be gradually degrading the military readiness to deal with North Korea's threats by skipping the joint military exercises, and also it could delay the Afghan transfer, which is a big political issue in Korea, at least by the Moon administration. They want to get the Afghan transfer before the end of the current administration's term, which is only about 1.5 years away. So, there are many different parts that have to be considered. But if North Korea resorts to any provocation, I think that will give us very good opportunity to resume joint military exercise. We don't have to miss that opportunity when North Korea, voluntarily offers us an opportunity to legitimize our joint military exercises. We don't have to miss it. But I don't know whether President Moon will accept that kind of exercises while he's anxiously waiting for the resumption of talks between U.S. and North Korea.
Thank you. For the sake of time, do any of our speakers want to take the Europe role and the NGO humanitarian organization role?
I could just say about the NGOs, I think they play
all of it.
It's very important. Health, food security, they're the only face of, let's say, the outside world, often in North Korea. When I had the job of dealing with North Korea, I dealt with them a lot. I found them very valuable, and they usually stayed very much in their lane. Great respect for them. When they can avoid getting, picked up by the regime and held, which they're pretty good about doing, I think that they're close to invaluable.
Ambassador Hill.
I completely agree with that, and I also agree with some of the discussion that we should not be mixing humanitarian aid with these issues. I think there's already threats of malnutrition in North Korea, and I think we need to be very, very careful that we haven't made those worse. And I think the NGOs do a tremendous job, and as Glyn just said, they do stay in their lane. I've never had issues with them. My issues were with other people in the government wanting to withhold humanitarian assistance. On exercises, the North Koreans have always asked that we suspend exercises, and it wasn't until they met Donald Trump that they got a yes answer. I'm very concerned about this idea that we tell the military they can't exercise. And I know this is, as Chun Yung-woo pointed out, I know this is a big issue for the Moon administration, but I'm concerned. I'm really concerned about where this is going, and I don't think we've gotten a lot from it, and I never would have put it on the table. So, and as for Europe, I think the Europeans, first of all, we should never be talking about North Korea talks without having thorough discussions with the Europeans on it. I don't know precisely what role, but I have no doubt that someone like the European Union needs to be involved.
Ambassador Gallucci.
I would see the European question in the context of normalization of relations. I would want the DPRK to look at Europe as an opportunity once North Korea was a normal country, that they would have political and economic relations that would be very beneficial to them being a normal country in Northeast Asia. That ought to, getting there ought to be on our agenda. We want a normal relationship with North Korea. We want North Korea to be a normal country. If it had invested, and if Europe invests in the North, and I mean that politically and economically, and the North invests in its relationships with the Europeans, it's a lot less likely that they'll go around sinking ships or shelling islands or doing other things that we regard as provocations consistent with who the North Koreans have been for decades. We want to move them, the word normal is a good one, to a normal position within the international community. And Europe can play a role in putting flesh on that concept.
Okay, we have time just for two quick questions to wrap up. One is from Bob Einhorn. Most of your questions, Bob, you've answered throughout the program, but he asks us, among them, a specific one in terms of how you kickstart diplomacy with North Korea in today and in the future, near future context. Would it be specifically things like public signals or reaching out privately through the New York channel or using third parties such as China or unilateral gestures to just help on COVID? So he's focusing that question a bit more than our discussion before. And the final question is from Glyn Ford in Belgium. Can North Korea keep a civil nuclear energy program and space program? Final two questions. Who'd like to go first? Bob, Ambassador Glyn, go with the civil nuclear energy program and space program. I give it to you.
All right. So, as you know, and others may, I thought that it was fine 25 years ago for the North to have light water reactors and not have enrichment, not have reprocessing, and not have fissile material, but to have a source of energy. Now, an analyst may say that the North's best approach to energy is not nuclear energy. There are lots of other ways of doing this, and I don't hold a brief for nuclear energy in North Korea. However, if that's what the North wanted, light water reactors, what we regard as proliferation resistant nuclear technology, I'd have no difficulty with that, and I would embrace it as a lot of us did 25 years ago. But it would have to come with the exclusions that there would be no uranium enrichment there, there would be no spent fuel reprocessing there would be no separated fissile material there, but there would be a source of energy for an economy that we would be presumably supportive of advancing. So I think a civil nuclear program is quite plausible. It would have to be a constrained and obviously one inspected by the IAEA. A space program, SLV, Space Launch Vehicle Program, is another matter entirely, and I am not enthusiastic about that. A country that is interested in putting its own satellites up can get space launch services from any number of other countries and have their satellites put up. And there is no way that I know of making the distinction between ballistic missile technology and space launch vehicle technology at a certain level. And we do not wish to see the North Koreans in the ballistic missile technology world. So I would say yes to nuclear energy, properly defined, but no to their own space launch vehicle program.
Talking about SLV, this reminds me of our last program, or light water reactors too, during the Clinton administration when Bob Joseph, Ambassador Hill, you told us no LWRs until pigs fly. But your space launch comment also reminds me of, right after the leap day deal that Ambassador Davies negotiated, North Korea tried to put launched a space into orbit, a satellite into orbit. And I remember Ambassador Chun at that time, very soon after that launch, you told me and a couple other people, I think I was in Seoul at that time, and he said, well, North Korea's claiming this is for peaceful purposes, for scientific for to view the Earth's atmosphere, if they really needed to view the Earth, they should just use Google Earth and not launch their own satellite. Ambassador Chun, would you like to take any of these questions?
Well, what I told Bob Joseph at the time, when he was Undersecretary for Arms Control, what I told him was that denuclearize North Korea with light water reactors is better for us than nuclear armed North Korea without light water reactors. That's what he said. And his response was that no light water reactors until pigs fly. So when he came to me for a farewell visit, the gift I made for him was, a flying pig that I especially tailored in a glassware shop for him. So that's the episode. But I would like to answer to Bob Ironhorn's question about how to reach out to North Korea. It's very dangerous to reach out to North Korea through a third party. In a civilized world, that's not a problem. But North Koreans take it as an insult. So even if it is at a lower level, like in New York Channel, they want to be approached directly by the US. Because if they are being contacted through other parties like China or Russia, they take it as a lack of respect for them. And that doesn't really help. So in that regard, I would advise strongly against any attempt to reach out to them through a mediator like China. When there's no way of communicating with the U.S., that's one way. But when they have an office, when they have a mission in New York, which they consider as a shadow embassy, and those people who contact the State Department they have nothing to do with the UN. They are for bilateral relations, and they are there for communication with the U.S. government. So why don't you use that channel to communicate U.S. intention to begin talks with North Korea?
Ambassador Hill and Ambassador Davies.
Yeah, I'd just like to add on that point. During my time, it was a big deal to reach out to the North Koreans. You had to tell everyone, including Bob Joseph, who was never in favor of talking to the North Koreans under any circumstances. I like to think that as a result of Singapore and Hanoi, and the issue of reaching out to the North Koreans is not going to be the problem it posed in the past. And I completely agree with Chun Yung-woo. I mean, to try to reach the North Koreans through someone else is really kind of to undo your own purpose. And as for LWRs, I mean, Bob Joseph hated the idea. A lot of people in Washington hated the idea. But if you look at the joint statement, which was our official position, we were prepared to discuss the provision of a light water reactor at an appropriate time. I must say, I got a lot of blank stares from the North Koreans over the course of my negotiations, but none more so than when I suggested solar energy and wind energy. I mean, they truly looked at me like I was a flaming idiot. So I agree with Bob Gallucci. What they want is some kind of, nuclear program. And I think the provision of some sort of tamper-resistant or diversion-resistant nuclear energy is probably going to be in the final mix if we're able to get to that point. Frankly, if we're at that point, it's kind of a good day, and we should be able to resolve it.
Final word, Ambassador Davies.
Just super quick. Yeah, I mean, I think the New York Channel is the way to go. It's tried and true. It's pretty private. You can do it face to face. We used to do that on occasion, send people up. Worked in the past, and it's a very good initial step. And we have every indication that, whatever messages we conveyed, go in a hot rocket right to Capitol leadership. So I think that's always a good way to do it.
We can talk for days and weeks about all these important issues, but I'm afraid we'll have to leave it at that. Thank you everybody for the questions. And I'm sorry we could not get through all of them, but I did notice we answered many of them throughout the program. So I hope that's okay with you and enough for you. I'd like to thank all of our speakers for sharing your wisdom, and to our audience in particular, members of the Bulletin's community and others all around the world for participating with us. I'd especially like to thank the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, President and CEO Rachel Bronson, Program Coordinator Hallie Posner, and all the staff. This event would not be possible without you. Please, everybody, check out the Bulletin's 75th Anniversary Magazine edition online. Ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are, good day and good night.
Thanks, Duyeon. Great job.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.